Well, a coach was somewhat of a Renaissance man.
A Renaissance man in a lot of different ways.
He's a class gentleman.
He was a family man, first and foremost. Barbara was just so wonderful with us, and you could tell that he loved his wife and his family.
And he's just a lot more than a football coach or a football mind.
So knowledgeable about the military.
I want to talk about the Civil War.
Always seemed to be weaving his pregame talks to us as a football team with some kind of military battle.
Master gardener.
I want to talk about, the type of bushes they had chosen for the hedges when they were replaced.
Also the horticulturist.
Vince took me out to the garden, and you know the rest. He's taken so many people out to the garden, and for an hour we were trapped into stuff that I knew nothing about and still don't remember anything he told me other than it was the most fascinating hour hearing about horticulture I've ever spent.
Every time I talk to him, I learn something. That's a coach.
Everybody knows about, the great Hall of Fame career he had as a head coach.
He forever put Georgia on the map.
If you were a Georgia person, you know about the 25 years that he was there as the athletic director.
It was such a dominant program for so long, and then he became the greatest ambassador of the sport I think we've ever had.
He took so many people away from football, as I've grown to understand.
To me, Dooley was the guy.
He transcended so many different times, from the 60s really almost until the 90s.
Because Dooley was kind of this connection between, started coaching when he's in his early 30s in the early 1960s, and Bear Bryant was really just getting things rolling in Alabama. And then when Vince Dooley retired as coach, these young guys were taking over. And so he was kind of the bridge between those two eras.
We spend too much time talking about that one championship, but he won so many SEC championships throughout his career. He beat Bryant, especially at the end. And I think that's the one thing that's overlooked is Vince Dooley's run in 80, 81, and 82 was up against Paul Bryant. This was not in a non-Nick Saban era or non-Bear Bryant era. He was the dominant coach in the SEC Bryant's last 3 years and played a role in not so much ending Bryant's career because they didn't play during that stretch, but they were battling for the top position.
First time I met Coach Dooley was after a high school playoff game loss to Wayne County at Valdosta High School. Lindsey Scott caught a 2-point conversion to beat us that night. And after the game, Coach Dooley came by our locker room, and it was the first time I met him. And he basically just said, look, enjoyed watching you play, and we look forward to talking to you down the road.
We used to do a radio show together every Thursday morning or something like that on WGST, and so they were really good. When I first moved to Georgia, the first year they won the national championship, and they could have won it again. And I'm like, well, there's nothing to this. This is simple. I mean, I'm just going to be covering national championship teams every year. I didn't know it was going to take 41 more years for them to do it again. But, they were so good compared to some of the other teams. And I remember one time I said they were getting ready to play Vanderbilt. So my question to Coach was, Coach, got a Vanderbilt team coming up this weekend. And I said, what do you see from them that's going to be a problem for you? And he said, well, Brad, I got to tell you, Vanderbilt's got the finest punter in the country. And we could talk about punters because that's the only thing he could find really nice to say about Vanderbilt.
Think about how different things are today. In 1980, Georgia was playing Auburn, and I believe the game, I can't remember. The game, I think the game was in Auburn that year. And I drove over from Birmingham. First got an interview with Coach Dooley, one-on-one. I mean, we went to his press conference, and I think it was in like a little schoolroom, like a classroom, versus what we have today, where it's all highfalutin television. And then Claude Felton, he was there, walked me over to the student union, and I waited outside and off a little bit with some distance, because we didn't want to draw any attention. And here comes Herschel Walker. And you think about that today, the odds of some guy getting in his car and driving over to Athens from Birmingham. We're not talking ESPN. We're talking a Birmingham newspaper reporter. And he had interviews with the head coach and the star player. Georgia was number 1 in the country. It was about 2 weeks after the famous Florida game that's been replayed 1,000 times. And and he was and Vince was appreciative. He was like, "Hey, well, thanks so much for coming over." Like, like I was doing him the favor as opposed to him, and that was just the way he was.
I think this probably speaks to just how maybe Coach viewed himself. We were in Macon for the Sports Hall of Fame ceremony, and my family was sitting at a table, and Coach was just kind of walking around, and he was greeting folks, of course, but also he was clearly just looking for a place to sit down. And I don't know that either they hadn't designated it or it just wasn't clear. And so he walked over to our table, and I wasn't seated at the time, and just asked if he could sit there. We were over there to the side, and he actually asked he was 11 years old at the time, son, if he could sit there with him. It was just funny because he Whit didn't know who Coach Dooley was. He'd met him before. He just didn't remember meeting him before, I guess. He regaled him for most of the evening, and those evenings are slow. And thank goodness for it, because he kept him occupied just about the entire time. And it did not look burdensome. You would have thought that Coach was just thrilled to be seated next to an 11-year-old who did not have a clear idea as to who he was.
So the last time we were together on the football field, we were playing in the Japan Bowl after my senior year. And on the flight over to Tokyo, he called me up to the first class seat he had, and he said, you've talked a lot about us not throwing the ball enough during our days at Georgia. And so I tell you what, we're going to let you come up with the playbook. You call your own plays in the game, and to just take that off my plate this week as he was the head coach. So that was a thrill. My first pass was a deep ball to Lindsey Scott, believe it or not. But I looked at the sideline. He had a big smile on his face, and I really appreciated that.
My first experience with Vince Dooley in person was his last game as a head coach. My dad was a college football official for 40 years. It was Coach Dooley's last game, and Ray Goff was the head coach in waiting, essentially, and Goff was really calling the game. And so we got down there expecting to get a classic Georgia, let's run the football 60 times and grind them down and win the game. Exactly. And Ray Goff was slinging it and dinging it, man. And then, meanwhile, Michigan State responded with that. And so it was for the era, it was a shootout. You kids are going to Google the score and go, "Oh, this wasn't a shootout." Well, for then it was. For 1988-89 it was. Years later, we had Coach Dooley on Marty McGee. It was at the SEC Championship game a couple years ago, and we sit down and we're actually going to tape this segment. We're getting ready to tape the segment, and Coach Dooley leans over and he says, "Ryan." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "How's your father?" I said, "Coach, he's doing great. In fact, he told me to tell you hello." He said, "Your father worked my last game as a head football coach." I go, "That's right." And he said, "That's the night your father and I joined forces to turn Andre Rison into a millionaire." I go, "You're right." And then he told me, he said that night, he said, he finally went to Goff and the staff at one point and go, "Okay, I was going to let y'all do this. I have to take over now because y'all are going to give me a heart attack in my last football game."
I had gotten to visit with him a little bit last week and sat down. He was in the training room, and we got to talk for a while. And, of course, I didn't know that would be the last time, but that's probably my fondest memory because even then he was telling stories about Georgia football, and he's been around my family. They've been in the box during these SEC championships and national championships, and my kids have gotten to be around him. And it's funny because my kids had no idea, like, who's the old coach, who's this old guy, and now they know the history and what all he stood for and what his family did for this university.